Welcome. Today's topic is Forms Composer. Forms Composer is part of the Lexmark suite of products, and it allows us to create forms that will then be loaded into the Lexmark printers. There's cards that go into our Lexmark printers that these forms are loaded into, and you'd want to watch the Forms Manager video on how forms actually get loaded in there and how we can go ahead and set them up. This one's focusing on actually creating a form. um, Being able to map data, being able to analyze that data, being able to create information, or basically a form. So stuff we'll talk about is within the composer, the left side, which is for the forms, the right side is for the data. How we do the variables, how we can configure some variables, the data maps that are set up, loading sample data, kind of doing the print preview to see how everything works. So let's go ahead and get started. I am going to minimize this. I am currently now in the app station. So the app station really, it's licensed, the Forms Composer is licensed by MAC address. So right now we have certain applications or certain workstations here at CDP that are that actually have the Forms Composer loaded. Um, Hold on one second, just making sure everything is good. So let me go ahead and start. So under here is Forms Composer. Forms Composer comes up. I mentioned the left side is for the form, the right side is for the data. Let me go ahead and I'm going to open up just a basic check template that we have here at CDP. So once this installs, so what do we got here? Again, I'll spread this out. This left side is the form, the actual form. So there is a form can be created by elements that are mapped from the right side. So anything over here in yellow is technically it's you kind of highlight a specific area, gives you a chance to make a call it whatever you want, variable name. And then once there, that's where it captures the data. And then you can go ahead, when data is in here, then you kind of map that variable name over to some area on the form. So let me go ahead and remove this. If I look up here at I can go ahead and look at hide some of the information over here for you. So you can go ahead and you hover over here and you can start to see what variables are there. So let's start over here on the left. So some of the stuff I have here is what we call subforms. And the idea behind subforms is you can actually create it once. So here we have our address, and I can go ahead and in any of my forms, I can go ahead and add this subform to it. And then all you have to do is change the subform, and it updates on the actual form. So when this form is created, it started off as blank, and someone went through and said, okay, here's my data on the right. I see my amount to. My amount to is right here. In order to get a field onto here, you simply hold the control button down, highlight what you want, and you can go ahead and you can bring it over here and you can drag it. Once you have a form on here, there's a few things you can do. So select on it, you right click, object properties. It's going to bring up this variable or this screen where you can start to change the font, you can adjust the filtering, you can add some text around there, and you can do certain things like that. Double clicking on this then takes you to another screen where you can do some customization. So in general, if I needed to change this to be a different variable name, originally it was amount 2, I want it to be amount 1 or something different like that, I can change it here. Because if this is functioning as a string, there's things that you can do to be able to do make it look a little bit nicer when it actually merges. So all of those you can see here. I can trim it, I can left and right, I can remove it, I can wrap it, I can do all kinds of other things. If it's being viewed as a number, then you've got other items here such as pad it with zeros, show negative values in red, certain things you can do. So it lets you kind of customize the variable, and then you can make different variables different, or act differently. So I have amount 2 here. Well, look down here. I have amount 2 here, and I also have amount 2 here, and they're both a little bit different. But what they're going to do is they're going to merge whatever gets captured in this amount 2 field and go ahead and bring that there. So you'll notice here that it captures because we don't know if this is going to be $14 or 14,000 or 14, million, so we got to expand it a little bit to be able to capture that. And that's a little bit of the troubleshooting. We've got this field set up here that we're determined is going to fit into this range, and someone does, a $14 billion check or whatever it is and extends out of there. It's only going to capture where this square is. So the left side again is the forms, and there's editing things that you can do up here along the top to be able to insert images, barcodes, PDFs, lines, certain things that you can all do. This allows you to move portions behind other portions and kind of go ahead and get it set. You can go up and I believe you can look at view. If I view listings, it's going to show me all the fields, and it kind of helps to be able to determine, all right, here's all the information down here. These are, as I mentioned, a couple of subforms that you can do. And I think you can right click on it and it'll show you properties or edit subform, and it gives you some different variables to do. A lot of the times it's easier just to see in the graphics aspect of it. So on the right side, again, we talked about it being data, and if you watch the other data or the Forms Manager, you saw how we capture data. So now that we've got data, we need to bring it in here. So you can go up here and you can do data, and you can load sample data. A lot of it is, right clicking does the same thing within here. So field maps. Field maps are where the variables that you set up on this right side. So this is how I'm mapping my data that's coming in to the data that's what's being displayed over in the form. So many times you're working with data that comes in shifted differently. So you may have it where it's in one case the name and address is down here. Maybe in a different case it's down here, depending on type of transaction they're running or certain things like that. So in that case, what do? You've got the same form because that's what you want to look at, but you create a couple of different form maps so that it recognizes, hey, if I find certain criteria here, I know it's this map I should use, and if I find another criteria, I use a different map, but both those maps kind of go to the same form here on the left. So let me hop over here. Again, this is where we can open, we can save, we can update form information, load sample data. This is where you go out and pick, and typically it's best to name it a certain way, .txt, and once you bring that in there, you see it, and it shows you how that data is now going to be mapped. So, I could bring it in, and all of a sudden I see this this address shifted up here. Then I would have to right click and say open up a different field map and then see if that one maps and stuff like that. So something a little confusing, but something that you do need to play around with a little bit. A big one down here, these are kind of self-explanatory. You can list fields and stuff like that, but data properties. So with data properties, it gives you a little snapshot of what field map is certainly displayed, what the type, which is text, and even what map is being used down here. But the critical one is down here in the delimiter section. So when we get this data, it could be broken up that said, these are 5 pages worth of data. How does the form know when it's supposed to do a page break and go back and reset that form again? Well, it depends on how that data comes across, and a lot of times you'd want to look at that in Notepad++ and kind of turn on viewing everything to be able to go ahead and see that. But in this case, we can go, after X number of lines, start a new page. If there's a form feed as part of that, start a new page, or get down to advanced, where you can again do multiple things on here, where I can go ahead and I can do number of pages. I can also skip, so you're really going to have to analyze the data and determine how best does it map to what you're doing, and what do you consider to be the delimiter. Again, everyone's a little bit different. So let me get out of here. So we've kind of got the stuff on the left, kind of got the stuff on the right, but how does it trigger? How does it know what form map it's going to have to grab based on the data coming across? Because really how the process works is the data flows through that card that I mentioned that's on within the printer. It looks at the data. There's got to be a trigger that says, based on me seeing this information, I know that this is a check, or I know this is something else. So under File, Activation Codes. This is kind of critical. So activation codes, you've got 2 sets of activation codes. You've got the project activation codes and you've got page activation codes. So start with project. Project says, hey, based on the conditions I set up here, I know that there's a form map that's associated with it. So what this is doing is it's looking to say, hey, condition 1 says that variable 2 contains a and asterisk. Variable 2 is this down here, this little box down here. And then variable 1 contains post date. And there's different things that you can do based on the variables. And I encourage you to look at it if you're looking for greater than, equal to, does not contain, contains, whatever it might be. So from a project activation, it says, hey, does this project have any activations that makes it valid for us to check? So in this case, yes, it says post date up here. I've got asterisks down here. Next is page activations. So it can be a little confusing because the page activations are typically mirror the project activations. But in this case, hey, once I know I'm into the page activations, now there may be some other criteria that you need to add, but in this case, it kind of mirrors the same. But what it does is it says, okay, you know what, if these conditions are true, use this form map that I'm showing up here. And then how do I output it? I output by saying, hey, you know what, page 1, I want to go to tray 1. You know what? So these forms actually control the pages excuse me, they control what trays things come out of. And there's some stuff down here, whether this is the first page, last page, certain things that you need to do. But you can go ahead and, you know what, if someone called and said, hey, this has been coming out on tray 1, I need it to be on tray 2, you could go into this, you basically change this to tray 2. Go ahead, save this, recompile it, load it to the printer, and in that way, the next time it goes and it recognizes that this is a check, it's going to go ahead and print it out on tray 2. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel that. So really, you need to get familiar with activation codes, both page activations and project activation. Again, it really, to reiterate, the project activations kind of determines, hey, is this map valid for the data that I'm seeing? And if it is, then okay, then I get into the page activations and it says, okay, based on this information, how do I determine what page and then what tray does it come out of, and some of the other things that you go ahead and do. Can get a little confusing. I'll show you one here in a second that has a lot of various activations, and I'll kind of explain why. So we've got the information here. Again, a lot of this formatting is done through the top here. It's done through subforms. It's kind of mapped over on this data. Sometimes they'll have the actual signature down here. One of the things to be mindful of is the number of pages. So you can have multiple pages down here, and it's based on, hey, when I capture this data, page 1 I want to do this, page 2 I want to do this, and you can set up multiple. So many times with checks, this one isn't set up that way, but with checks, the first one goes actually to the printer, comes out on the check stock. We print page 2, which might have the word copy or might have the word something else in there, that will go to plain paper, and that may be for the bank or credit union's standpoint. So when we have this information that you see here, we want to test to see if it works. Hey, I've got my activation codes, I got everything looking good. Let me select on print preview up here at the top. You always want to merge it with perform a merge, because you want to actually see what's going to happen when it merges on the printer. We're going to go ahead and save it because I moved some stuff around. This will give you a warning or an error message if it comes up and it says, hey, no activation codes match this. Then you go back to the drawing board and kind of look at what's happening here. So it took that data, it merged it together, and it shows you what typically it should come out on that printer. Now, we've had experiences where it looks great here. It functions a little bit different on the printer. So I do encourage you, before you kind of release it to the customers, to maybe load it to one of our existing printers here, run the data through, and kind of see what if it looks right. So on the printer side of the standpoint, what happens is this data comes through. If it doesn't find any forms that actually map, what it does is it actually what you'll hear called default, and default just says it goes to whatever tray is set up in that printer as a default tray, typically plain paper, and comes out. So people will call and say, hey, my check didn't quite print properly, it came out on the wrong tray. Well, what do you do about that? Well, you'd have to look at capturing data and kind of determining, hey, what is part of my activation codes that are kind of messed up, and why didn't it recognize this? And again, that could be because it shifted data. That could be from various other reasons that we'll possibly get into in a different in a different video. So kind of talked about that. I want to show you one more. So I'm going to close this out. Let me go back into my Forms Composer to give you a little bit of sense in regards to the how complex some of this stuff can be. So a lot of times you would have, as this loading out, a lot of times you would have different maps, is because on page 1, information comes over slightly shifted because there's control characters and certain things out there different than page 2. Or in this case, as you see with my loan payment coupons, and I'm going to be calling up here, you have to determine how many coupons are actually being printed for each person. So you got to do some evaluation to figure out how many pages I'm actually going to go ahead and print. So give me a second for this to go ahead and call up. So let me go ahead and expand this. So you'll notice as you look at this, and let me brag it over to make it a little bit bigger, you'll notice down here I've got 28 pages worth of data. So as I start clicking through this, you'll start to see the data, different things come up. You know what, if I went in here and I did my data properties and I changed this to be, so this one's kind of set up to be advanced. And it's looking for, in this case, it's looking for these to know when to do a line break. If I change something, save it and come back into it, you'll start to see these pages change. You'll also notice down here that I've got 6 pages of loan payment coupons. They all look the same. They've got slightly different, you'll notice some of the names can change or something like that. And that depends on how many data is being mapped. So in this case, you know what, I've got Katrina here that's mapping a few different times, and then David that's doing a little bit different. But let's take a quick look at the page activation or activation conditions for this one. So you'll notice in this case there's 2. The one I showed you previously had 1. This one has 2. So it's looking to say if variable 1 contains an L, I'm going to use this. If variable 1 also contains an L. So why would, you're going to ask, why are both of those the same? Why? Well, what's going to happen is depending on how the data comes in, variable 1 for this first map isn't going to come back with anything because variable 1 is in a different spot. Then it's going to say, okay, well, let me evaluate this other map, variable 1. Oh, yeah, I found it. So depending on which one it finds, it knows, okay, good. This isn't actually a loan payment coupon data. Now it next goes into the page activations. You'll notice over here there's 10, and then if you start looking at the details here, it says, okay, you know what, I'm looking at a field within that data. If that field is less than 0, that means I've only got 1 page worth of forms. Boom, I'm only going to print 1 page. And I'm using this map. So it's kind of looking at, okay, you know what, I found it. This page is actually greater than 0, but page 7 is less than 0. So now I know I have 2 pages of loan payment coupons for this person. So you'll notice over here, page 1 comes out on tray 3, page 2 comes out on tray 3. So really what you're doing is you've got, hey, how many loan payment coupons am I actually doing? And then what map am I using? And then from there, what trays do they go ahead and print on. So again, there's a lot of really analysis that needs to be done on how the data is coming in, how information is being tracked. But I'll cancel this. Let me go ahead and merge this one, kind of show you one other thing that I want to point out. So as this merges, there's a couple of things you'll see when it merges. And it's based on how your activation conditions are coming up. And I showed you that, whether it's first page, last page, and certain things like that. So sometimes you'll see a bunch of PDFs down here. That's really kind of rifling through this a few times, and it's creating a new PDF every single time. Or in this case, you'll notice that there's 36 pages up here. So, as I start poking through the pages, you'll start to see the names change. And it's all based on the information that's coming over and how many pages we need to print for each and what is some of the stuff that we need to go ahead and do. So, very mindful of how many pages are over here, how many pages are over on the right, and kind of figure out a little bit more about what's happening. So, and this error message just has to do with some of the fields that I have installed here. This is a test. So let me take a look at my Word document here. So we talked about the different sides. We talked about mapping the variables, how you can kind of, once you map it on the right, you simply drag and drop, name a variable, and then you kind of use that to be able to say this, variables in this name. And you can have overlapping variables, as you saw. And sometimes you have to get specific. You really got to look at what identifies this from a different check and that type of stuff. Configuration of what we can do. We can change the fonts. We can kind of do some of the padding and certain things like that. The different data maps. So again, an individual form on the left can have multiple data maps on the right. It all depends on how that data is coming over and how it's shifted. Sample data. Again, you'll want to see in the Forms Manager of how we actually capture that sample data, and then you can go ahead and bring it in the Forms Composer to be able to see how that works. We talked about print preview. So really, when I'm thinking about next steps, you really want to get in there that we've got some templates that are under the O Drive, CDP, and go ahead and create a copy of that and begin looking at it. You want to understand what's part of the main form, what's part of the sub form, how do you change one and how does it impact the other one. Let's take a blank slate, let's copy some data, let's go ahead and map it over. We've got some documentation that's very detailed on how a lot of this stuff works, but you're really going to have to play around with it to really get familiar with activation codes, with forms, with merging it, with how you get it into the printer and stuff like that. So I know this was a little lengthy. Tried to cover a lot of details in as little bit of time as possible, but hopefully in the end you're able to at least get a general idea of how this Forms Composer works. Thank you.